Hi, I'm Jacob Heilbrunn, the editor of the National Interest. I'm here today with John Judis, a senior editor at the New Republic and a former colleague and longtime friend of mine. And John's new book, called Genesis, is creating a furor in the intellectual community. The subtitle is Truman, American Jews and the Origins of the Arab-Israeli Conflict. His book is reviewed in the latest issue of the National Interest by Bernard Wasserstein, a fairly critical review. At the same time, John also has a quite critical review of Stephen Sestanovich in the same issue. And John is a skilled and long-time journalist. John, the first question is, why is your book causing so much controversy?
Well, I think it's because it comes at a pivotal time in American-Israeli relations where the ice is beginning to crack and where skepticism about the way we've conducted ourselves towards Israel is coming to the fore. And I think the book crystallizes some of that, and people who don't want that kind of debate are furious about my book. It's not I'm not a flaming radical. I'm a two-state guy. I mean, I'm not for abolishing Israel or anything like that. I am very critical of the occupation, the settlements, the Netanyahu government. I think the United States has to get behind a two-state solution that's fair to both sides, to the Palestinians and the Israelis. But still, even the forthright presentation of that is getting me into trouble.
John, one of the central contentions of your book that's aroused controversy too is your claim, which is made at the very beginning of the book, that Truman was muscled over, if that's the right word, by the nascent American Jewish lobby or community, if you want to use that word. And what led you to the conclusion that Truman was did this against his better instincts? I know that in the State Department you had many of the establishment foreign policy types, from George C. Marshall, George F. Kennan, James Forrestal, were all quite violently opposed to the idea of recognition of the Jewish state in 1948. But why do you think that Truman was not so receptive to this notion? Can you explain that?
Okay, there's a lot of things buried in that one question, and I think, first of all, I think Truman would have recognized the state of Israel in any case. In terms of political pressure, the reason the way political pressure worked was that he recognized it 15 minutes after Ben-Gurion announced the state, and he was worried at the time about rallies that were taking place across the country, and he wanted to forestall criticism of himself. It was an election year. But I think he really had no choice at that point. If you go back farther, what you find about Truman is that he just from the time he took office in 1945, he was skeptical of the idea of a Jewish or an Arab state. He was really opposed to a state that was based upon either, they used to call it race then, we would say now a people or a religion. He thought that was a bad idea. He was a Jeffersonian Democrat. America was his model, a place where, you know, we went to war in the Civil War, but other than that, we have all these ethnic groups that hate each other but still get along. He wanted to see that he wanted to see something like a federation or a binational state where the Jews and the Arabs could get along, could govern the state together. And that's the kind of proposal that he initially backed with the British in this thing called the British-American Committee. And he remained committed to that in the back of his mind throughout his presidency. But in August 1946, which was again on the eve of a very important congressional election, he buckled under pressure, really, and that's the point at which I would say that the what was called then the Zionist lobby had a tremendous amount of influence on him. He gave up this idea of a federated state, which he had gotten the British and the American representatives to sponsor, to champion. It was in something called the Morrison-Grady proposal, and he just backed down, and that was the end of it. Throughout, though, I found letters from Truman that he wrote on May 15th, the day after he recognizes Israel, saying that he wished it had turned out differently, that he liked the proposals of the British-American Committee. May 18th, he writes a letter. In September of that year, that's like 5-6 months after he recognizes Israel, a delegation from the Jewish war veterans comes to see him, and he thinks it's a kind of routine visit, but instead they lobby him strenuously to give arms to the Israelis. And he gets annoyed at the lobbying, and he says, I wish it had turned out differently. If only we had, the people had listened to the proposals of the British-American Committee. But it was the emotional Jews and the Arabs and the British. He would blame various people at various times that forced us to abandon that proposal. But, again, just to return on a practical level, he gives up after August 1946. And when you get to May of 1948 and Israel declares itself a state, he really didn't have any choice. At that point, of course, the whole idea of federation by national state is not going to happen. Yeah, the two sides at each other's throat. The Arab armies were going to invade. The other thing is that the State Department really didn't have a realistic alternative. They kept wanting the British to come in. Not to come in so much as the British were going to leave, and they wanted them to stay and maintain a trusteeship in Palestine until the two sides could cooperate. And they kept sending delegations over to Britain, and the British kept explaining, no, we can't do that. We don't want to do that. We're getting out. Goodbye. And the State Department wouldn't take no for an answer, but they got a no. And on May 14th, they had no alternative whatsoever. So Truman would have had to do it. He might not have had to do it 15 minutes afterwards, but he would have done it, let's say June 1st. They were also worried about the Soviet Union beating them to the punch, too, and recognizing Israel before them. I think that, in addition to the rallies, were factors. So it's I'm not doing an alternative history in that sense. I think what happened is pretty much what had to happen. There were a few times when things could have been different, but that was what's interesting about Truman is that he always had this other idea in his mind. And what that was based upon, I think, are valid principles, are principles that that would help us now, which is first the idea that we have to have some arrangement over there that's fair to both sides. So the two-state solution that's fair to both sides. He was a moralist. He was morality was very important to his foreign policy. And the second thing was he was worried about the war, riot, and rebellion would follow if you tried to impose either a Jewish or an Arab state. And, for 50 years, 60 years, that's exactly what we've had. And it's not in our interest as Americans. It's not in the Israelis' interest, and it's not in the Palestinians' interest to have that continue. So it's very much in our interest to press now for a two-state solution.
One of the criticisms that Bernard Wasserstein made of your book in the review in the National Interest was that he felt that you have exaggerated the influence and sway of the Zionist or the Israel or whatever lobby you want to call it. That in fact Dwight D. Eisenhower, for example, was did not look upon the Jewish state favorably, that AIPAC does not have a record of unbroken successes. What's your response to that?
Well, look, my first response is the book actually ends in 1949, or August of 1949, when Truman just gives up. He tries to do something about refugees and the
you
borders.
did say that it set the pattern for
Oh yes, and it absolutely did.
A
pattern doesn't mean that it happens in every case. Eisenhower, sure, AIPAC itself didn't exist until 1963. There was something called the American Zionist Council before that, and it was pretty much a one-man operation in the 1950s. And after 1948, the Zionist movement itself almost disappears. I mean, there's still support, but there isn't before then there were 200,000 people. It was a very powerful social movement, especially when you consider that social movements aren't that big in America. That's a lot, and they could generate a lot of pressure. But it pretty much disappears after 1948. So you didn't have a lot of pressure then. AIPAC really starts to go in the 70s, in the late 70s, and they lose a few things. They lose the vote over the AWACS, the aerial reconnaissance planes, the Saudis. But since 1974, Israel has gotten the most foreign aid, and it's not because of the Camp David thing. It started before that. Tremendous support when it counts, and that's a lot of that's the result of AIPAC being a very powerful player in American politics.
But you have a new article coming out in Foreign Policy saying that AIPAC has passed the zenith of its power. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct, Jacob. You caught me on. Yes, that's right. It's a rise and decline story. I mean, the Iran thing has been very telling as far as AIPAC's clout goes, and do you want me to discuss why I think it's?
I'm just curious. Yeah. Just as a morsel to our.
Yeah, no, that's fine. I think there's a few things that happened. First of all, the base of the Zionist and then what later became the pro-Israel movement were Jewish liberal Democrats. That was it. I mean, it wasn't Republicans. There were people like Jacob Javits that Jewish liberals voted for, but it was, for the most part, you could just say liberals but mostly Democrats. That base has eroded, and the reason it's eroded is because the Likud party has been in power. I keep putting this down in stories, and the years keep shifting. Maybe, let's say, 30 out of the last 37 years, but a long time. I mean, Labor was out in 1977. They've continued to expand the settlements, intransigent about the occupation, not seemingly interested in making a deal, and that's eroded the support. Second thing that's happened was that in the 80s, the Israelis were seen as central to the Cold War and as a central player in American foreign policy in the Middle East. During George W. Bush, they were seen as part of the war on terror. That's over, and you see, I think in official Washington now, if I can use that phrase, establishment Washington, in the in the bowels of the State Department, the Pentagon, the CIA. The Israeli-Palestinian thing is seen as something that needs to be resolved in order to create some measure of stability in the Middle East, and I think that's reflected in the urgency that Kerry is putting into this effort. That now the priority is not so much to play ball with the Israelis, but to get them to make a deal with the Palestinians. So we don't have to worry about that in addition to Syria, et cetera, et cetera.
So in some ways, this is a requiem for neoconservatism, too. Is that correct?
Oh, I compare the neoconservatism more to the Freddy Krueger and Nightmare on Elm Street. You keep thinking that the guy is dead, and then, whoop, there's some new. You've written this too. I mean, every 10 years we say, oh, they're finished. End of Cold War, 1989, done with, and sure enough, by the late 90s, Weekly Standard, all that, end of Iraq War, finished, but we'll see.
Well, on that evocative note, I would like to, Freddy Krueger, I would like to conclude. Thank you.